The dancing girl carries the head to her mother on a platter.
Yeah, I mean, it is just an incredibly jarring image. It serves as this brutal centerpiece for a text that is otherwise totally focused on healing and community.
Right. And if you are joining us for this deep dive into Mark chapter 6 today, you really need to get ready. Because, well, we are looking at one of the most brilliant and honestly one of the cruelest structural moves in ancient literature.
Oh, absolutely.
Here is the massive contrast playing out for you today. On one hand, you have this grassroots movement of, incredibly vulnerable healers, and they are successfully expanding across the dusty villages of Galilee.
Yeah, and right alongside it.
Exactly. Almost in split screen, a truth-teller's voice is permanently silenced at a royal dinner party.
It really is the ultimate juxtaposition, isn't it? I mean, you are watching established power violently protecting itself, and that's set directly against this radical new movement that is somehow expanding through absolute weakness.
Our mission for this deep dive is to really get to the bottom of that tension. So we are going to unpack the intense political landscape of the first century, the rigid rules of ancient honor cultures, and the shocking drama of this specific text.
We're looking at how familiarity breeds contempt.
Right, and how a regional ruler's creeping paranoia directly leads to murder.
But, to understand how this grassroots movement eventually spreads across Galilee, we first have to examine where it heads a massive brick wall.
Yeah.
And that wall is Jesus' own hometown.
We are talking about Nazareth, which in the first century, this was not some sprawling metropolis, right?
No, not at all.
It was just a modest agricultural village in Lower Galilee, with a population likely numbering just in the hundreds. And it lived completely in the shadow of the nearby Roman administrative city of Sepphoris.
Right, and that geographical proximity is vital context here, because Sepphoris was a booming, wealthy city requiring constant construction. Meanwhile, Nazareth was just the tiny satellite village where the laborers lived.
I see.
So when Jesus returns to this familiar place, enters the synagogue and begins teaching on the Sabbath, he's not stepping into a neutral environment. The response from his neighbors is essentially outright rejection.
They completely dismiss him. And the text gives us a very specific reason why. They look at him and bring up his profession. The Greek word used here is tektun. We usually hear that translated as carpenter, but it was actually a much broader term, wasn't it?
Much broader, and significantly less romantic than the modern idea of a craftsman building fine furniture.
Right.
Tektun covered woodworkers, stonemasons, and general construction laborers. In the ancient world, this trade was fundamentally associated with grueling manual labor. It carried a very low social standing.
Yeah.
And crucially, a presumption of ignorance in religious matters. When the people of Nazareth look at Jesus' teaching, they don't see a rabbi. They see the calloused hands of a day laborer who probably hauled rocks in Sepphoris.
And they don't just weaponize his job either. They bring up his entire family tree to put him in his place.
Right.
The crowd literally says, "Isn't this the carpenter, the son of Mary and brother of James, Joses, Judah, and Simon? Aren't his sisters here with us?"
Yeah.
It feels so incredibly targeted. I mean, it's highly unusual in this patriarchal culture to identify a man by his mother. Why do they focus so heavily on Mary?
Well, the text may suggest they are signaling illegitimacy or simply that Joseph was dead.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, either reading would have carried immense social weight in that culture. By naming his family, they are essentially stripping him of any prophetic authority in the very place where you might assume his authority would be most naturally accepted.
Let's unpack this with a modern lens, because human nature hasn't really changed that much.
No, it hasn't.
Imagine you have a childhood friend who suddenly tries to become a leader. Or maybe they get promoted to be your boss at a company. But when you look at them, you can't see the suit or the new title.
Right, you just see the kid from the sandbox.
Exactly. You can only see the kid who used to eat dirt in the sandbox. The familiarity actually functions as a weapon. His neighbors use his ordinary known background to completely neutralize his extraordinary message.
Right, because in a shaman honor culture, your status is inherited and fixed. You do not simply decide to elevate yourself to the status of a teacher or a prophet.
Wow.
The village acts as a social immune system, rejecting the anomaly to maintain the established order. They aren't just disagreeing with his theology, they are violently enforcing social boundaries.
So, stymied by his own neighbors, how does a leader keep his movement alive? You might expect him to build a war chest or consolidate power.
Yeah.
Instead, Jesus deploys a tactic that seems absolutely suicidal in the ancient world. What was this radical strategy?
The strategy is deliberate destitution. He dispatches the 12, sending them out in pairs, but he completely strips them of provisions.
It's
The
wild.
text outlines incredibly specific limitations for this mission.
The instructions are wild. He commands them to take nothing for their journey except a staff. No bread, no wallet, no money in their purse. They are told to wear sandals,
Yeah.
and specifically told not to put on 2 tunics. Now, wait a minute.
I know.
That sounds like terrible leadership. If you want your movement to survive, you fund it.
Okay.
You don't starve your best people. Setting them out with literally no money or food sounds like going on a cross-country road trip with no credit cards or cell phone,
Oh, definitely.
just relying entirely on couch surfing. Why make them so incredibly vulnerable?
Because that vulnerability forces a specific kind of structural interaction. This wasn't a test of endurance, right? It was a brilliant mission strategy that relied entirely on the radical hospitality economy of the ancient Near East.
The radical hospitality economy.
Exactly. In this culture, accepting a traveling guest into your household or rejecting them was a highly significant social and economic act. By sending them out with nothing, Jesus ensures they arrive as supplicants, not as independent operators.
If you're listening to this and thinking about how you'd react if 2 barefoot guys showed up at your front door demanding dinner, you realize just how invasive this strategy actually was.
Oh, for sure.
If they showed up well-funded, with their own food and supplies, they could remain totally independent. They could preach in the town square, sleep in their own tents, and leave without ever actually engaging the community.
Right. But by showing up hungry and exposed, they force the village to make an active choice. Hospitality becomes the very mechanism of the movement's spread.
That is fascinating.
If a household takes them in, they are not just providing a bed, they are participating in the movement, they are accepting the message by physically sustaining the messengers.
But what happens when that hospitality is denied?
Yeah.
Because Jesus gives them a very specific, almost theatrical protocol for rejection.
He tells them to shake the dust off their feet. This is a fascinating detail because that gesture was actually borrowed from a Jewish practice used when leaving Gentile territory. Yeah. Observant Jews would shake the dust off their feet to avoid bringing the impurity of pagan lands back into the Holy Land.
So he is instructing his disciples to do this to Jewish towns that reject them.
Yes. By doing so, he is reframing that rejection as a kind of ritual impurity.
That is a stark boundary line.
Yeah.
He's effectively saying, if this village won't extend the basic covenant of hospitality to you, treat them as if they have placed themselves completely outside the covenant entirely.
Precisely. And this decentralized, completely vulnerable, dust-shaking movement begins to spread rapidly across the Galilean villages. They're essentially building an alternative society right under the nose of the regional authorities.
Right.
And that kind of noise doesn't stay local for long.
The grassroots healing and preaching campaign works so well that rumors eventually echo upward into the highest halls of power. Specifically, they reach the ears of a terrified, deeply compromised ruler.
We are talking about Herod Antipas. He was the son of Herod the Great, and he was the tetrarch of Galilee and Perea.
The tetrarch.
Right. A tetrarch is literally the ruler of a fourth part of a kingdom. It is a title that constantly reminded him of his fractured, localized power, ruling entirely under Roman oversight.
When Herod hears about Jesus and the miracles happening in the villages, his reaction is pure panic.
Total panic.
He is absolutely convinced that John the Baptist, the man he already executed, has returned from the dead, which, I mean, it feels completely irrational for a guy with an army to be panicking about a dead man coming back to life.
It does seem irrational, yeah.
Is this just ancient superstition, or is there a political reason he's losing his mind?
Oh, it is deeply political. Herod Antipas occupies an incredibly unstable structural position.
How so?
Well, he is powerful enough to arrest and execute a popular preacher like John, but he is not powerful enough to do it without an intense, lingering fear of the crowd.
Right.
He is a junior client ruler. Rome granted him his territory, but they pointedly refused to give him the title of king.
Even though Mark pointedly calls him king throughout this scene.
Exactly. Mark uses the title Antipas desperately wanted, but which Rome repeatedly denied him. It highlights the profound pretension of his court. He is constantly performing his power because his actual foundation is so incredibly fragile.
Speaking of fragile foundations, there's a bizarre geographic fact we have to mention here. Wait, Herod built his royal court at Tiberias on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee, directly on a cemetery. Doesn't that make it ritually unclean to observant Jews?
It absolutely does. When the foundations for Tiberias were being dug, they unearthed ancient graves. For an observant Jewish person in the first century, walking over a grave incurred a severe level of ritual impurity.
Wow.
Consequently, the most devout religious leaders refused to live there. Herod had to forcefully populate his own capital.
So you have this ruler trying to project absolute divine authority over a Jewish populace, yet he is ruling from a palace that the deeply observant wouldn't even set foot in. It adds this thick layer of toxicity to everything he does. Which brings us to the backstory Mark unspools for us. To understand why Herod is so haunted by the ghost of John the Baptist, we have to look inside this ritually unclean, blood-soaked birthday banquet.
The political tension leading up to this banquet is thick, centering entirely on Herod Antipas's doubly scandalous marriage to Herodias.
Herodias had previously been the wife of his own half-brother, Philip.
Yes, and to marry her, Antipas divorced his first wife, who happened to be a Nabatean princess.
You don't just divorce a foreign princess and send her packing without facing massive geopolitical consequences.
You certainly don't. That reckless move eventually brought brutal military retaliation from her father, King Aretas IV, who destroyed Herod's army.
Oh, wow.
So, when John the Baptist publicly denounces Antipas's marriage to Herodias, you have to understand this is not merely a religious complaint about bedroom morality.
It's pure political destabilization.
Exactly. John is questioning the fundamental legitimacy of the ruling household in front of a population that is already restless and heavily taxed under this Roman-backed Herodian rule. He is striking at the absolute weakest point in Herod's armor.
And yet, here is where it gets incredibly tragic. Mark 6.20 tells us that Herod actually feared John.
Yeah.
He knew John was a righteous and holy man. The text says Herod kept him safe, and when he heard him, he did many things and heard him gladly.
That is the devastating psychological core of this chapter. You have a client ruler who secretly admires the very man he is going to execute.
It's crazy.
The murder doesn't happen because of pure hatred. It happens in the treacherous gap between Herod's private conscience and his desperate need for public performance.
It's like a high-stakes corporate executive making a reckless promise at a board meeting and bankrupting the company just to avoid looking weak in front of his shareholders, but with lethal consequences. The tragedy isn't that Herod hates John, it's that Herod loves his own public image more.
Look at the social mechanics of this birthday banquet. The room is filled with his military commanders and the leading men of Galilee. This isn't a casual family dinner.
Right.
This is the entire apparatus of regional power sitting at his tables, eating his food, judging his authority.
In the middle of this high-status, high-pressure environment, Herodias' daughter dances. Herod is pleased, and he makes this incredibly reckless oath, promising her anything she asks, up to half his kingdom.
Right, and prompted by her mother, she doesn't ask for land or gold. She asks for the head of John the Baptist on a platter.
And Herod is trapped.
He is completely paralyzed by the honor culture of the ancient world. In that system, social credit is the literal currency of survival. If you lose face, you lose your army's respect, and eventually you lose your life.
Wow.
He cannot refuse his stepdaughter's request after swearing a public oath. To back down in front of his generals would make him appear impossibly small and weak.
So John dies because a ruler cannot afford to look weak in front of the men who enforce his authority.
Exactly. And the cruelest structural move Mark makes is interleaving these two narratives so tightly. While the 12 are out in the dusty villages, preaching, relying on the kindness of strangers to expand this movement of life, John is sitting in a dark cell downstairs, waiting for an executioner to sharpen a blade.
That is intense.
One movement expands through poverty, and one prophetic voice is silenced by a ruler protecting his pride at a lavish, ritually unclean feast.
It is a chilling split screen. But Mark doesn't let us linger in the palace of death. We leave the decapitated prophet, and we return to the expanding movement.
Right.
The 12 return from their mission, gathering around Jesus to report everything they've done. Jesus tries to pull them away by boat to a quiet place to rest. But the movement has grown so massive, so hungry for this healing, that the crowds literally run ahead and beat them there by land.
They cannot escape the momentum. The sheer volume of human need intercepts them. And this leads directly into the famous feeding of the 5,000, where Jesus takes just 5 loaves and 2 fish and miraculously sustains this massive crowd in the wilderness.
We have to contrast these two feasts.
Yes.
You just had Herod's banquet, an exclusive elite gathering of powerful men inside a palace built on graves, ending in death. And immediately after, you have Jesus hosting a massive, inclusive feast out in the open wilderness, feeding the poorest laborers, and it ends in overwhelming, miraculous life.
It's beautifully structured.
But the drama doesn't stop there. Right after this staggering provision, Jesus forces the disciples into a boat to go ahead to the other side while he dismisses the crowd and goes up on the mountain to pray.
As evening comes, the boat is out in the middle of the Sea of Galilee, and the wind turns violently against them. They're straining at the oars, physically exhausted and struggling against the storm.
Right.
Jesus walks out across the wind-churned water toward them. He nearly passes them by, but they cry out in terror. He climbs into the struggling boat, and immediately the wind drops.
They just watch 5,000 people fed from a tiny basket of food, yet they are completely baffled on the boat. Are they missing the point entirely?
They are missing it entirely. Mark 6.52 delivers what feels like a definitive, crushing verdict from the narrator. The text says, "For they hadn't understood about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened."
Hardened hearts. That is a loaded theological phrase. It's usually reserved for the villains of the story, like Pharaoh in Egypt, or the hostile religious elite.
It is a devastating critique. It shows that the disciples, the absolute closest insiders to this radical movement, are just as blind to the reality of who Jesus is as the political and religious leaders who actively oppose him.
Unbelievable.
The miracles are happening right in front of them, flowing through their own hands, but they cannot grasp the true scale of the power they are participating in.
So what does this all mean for you as you absorb this text? We've seen a hometown violently reject its own to protect its social order. We've watched a paranoid client king execute a righteous prophet just to save face at a dinner party.
Yeah.
And we've seen the inner circle completely fail to understand the miraculous power sustaining them. Yet despite all of this blindness and opposition, the movement just keeps moving forward.
Yeah. It never stalls. They finally land the boat on the shores of Gennesaret.
Which brings this deep dive to its final geographic location. And the reception at Gennesaret is the exact opposite of what he experienced back in Nazareth.
Before we go, though, consider this final provocative thought.
Okay.
Think back to that massive crowd of 5,000. The few loaves and fish Jesus used to feed them didn't just materialize out of thin air. They were offered up by the crowd. The food likely came from the very radical hospitality network the disciples had just built in those villages.
Wow, that completely flips how you read the miracle. The grand miracles of this text don't happen in a vacuum. They are built directly on the foundation of human vulnerability and shared resources.
Exactly. There's so much more mechanism and history beneath the surface of these ancient texts if you know exactly where to look.
That brings us to the end of our exploration today, but I want to turn this over to you listening. Which ancient social dynamic fascinated you more? I mean, the radical hospitality economy of the villages, where showing up with absolutely nothing was the ultimate strategy, or the lethal honor culture of Herod's banquet, where saving face cost a man his head. Drop a comment below and share your thoughts on today's historical drama. And if you enjoyed this deep dive, please make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss our future deep dives. Also, be sure to check the description below for exclusive links to maps, source texts, and extended reading on Herod Antipas and the Herodian dynasty.
There really is so much more to explore.
As they land at Gennesaret, the sick are frantically carried out on mats just to touch the hem of his cloak. The movement is exploding. In the next chapter, we'll see exactly what happens as this unstoppable crowd continues to grow and collide with the authorities. Join us next time to find out.